Another crucial sector of the economy bracing for impact is the lumber industry.
Sawmills like this one are already starting to reach out to their U.S. customers to see if orders are going to keep coming in at the start of a trade war that could seriously cut into their business.
It's just a way higher quality. Like, we're on the coast, and the species that we saw here are unique to this area. For one thing, you can't really buy it anywhere else, you know. And then in the interior mills, where it's a shorter growing season, the lumber is just superior to what they can manufacture in the U.S. And that is something that, you know, that we've heard from the U.S. customers. They want our wood because it is a superior building product.
The lumber fight did not cool down. It hardened. And that changes the whole story. Back in October, you could still talk about Trump's lumber policy as a threat, a negotiation tactic, another escalation headline in a long Canada-US dispute. That is no longer enough. Because now the tariff architecture is real, layered, and expensive on both sides of the border. Since October 14, 2025, the United States has had a new Section 232 tariff in force on softwood timber and lumber imports, while the older anti-dumping and countervailing duties on Canadian softwood never went away. Canada's official update page shows that, after the 6th administrative review, the combined duty rate for many Canadian softwood shipments rose to around 35.16% for the all others category, before you even add the newer Section 232 layer. That means the lumber story is no longer, will Washington go through with this? It is, what happens when America makes one of its own core housing inputs permanently more expensive? And that is where this becomes a much bigger trade economics story. Because the United States is not tariffing some marginal import here. It is tariffing a load-bearing input into its own housing system. Reuters reported in late 2025 that Trump set a 10% tariff on lumber imports and higher rates on certain wooden downstream products, while Canadian producers were already facing combined anti-dumping and anti-subsidy duties of about 35% on softwood. Reuters also quoted the U.S. Chamber of Commerce warning that the measures would raise costs for U.S. businesses and home construction and reduce incomes in many American communities. That is the first big shift since October of 2025. The second is this. Canada is no longer reacting as if this is a temporary insult that will pass. It is adapting as if this is the new normal. That is a major change. Last August, Ottawa moved to support the sector directly, with up to $1.2 billion in help for softwood producers, including about $700 million in loan guarantees and $500 million for product development and market diversification. Then in November, Reuters reported that Canada would work with railway companies to cut interprovincial freight rates for steel and lumber by 50% beginning in early 2026. That is not just compensation. That is rerouting strategy. It means Canada is trying to make it cheaper to move goods inside the country and to alternative markets when U.S. access becomes more hostile or less profitable. So the current story is no longer, Trump threatens, Canada protests. It is Washington hardens the tariff regime, and Canada shifts from protest into protection and diversification mode. That distinction matters, because once firms and governments stop treating tariffs as temporary noise and start treating them as durable structure, behavior changes, investment changes, shipping changes, contracts change, market strategy changes, and that is exactly what we are now seeing. Reuters reported in January 2026 that Canada's share of exports going to the United States had fallen to 67.3%, the lowest non-pandemic level since the current data method began in 1997, while exports to non-US markets hit a record high. Reuters tied that trend directly to Trump's tariffs and Ottawa's diversification push. Lumber is not the whole story there, but it is clearly part of the pattern. U.S. pressure is teaching Canadian sectors to think more in terms of risk management and alternative outlets than automatic continental integration. Now let's talk about the US side, because this is where the policy becomes self-destructive. America still needs Canadian lumber. That dependency did not vanish because tariffs went up. What changed is that Washington chose to make that dependency more expensive. And that lands in the one place the US economy can least afford more cost pressure: housing. Reuters reported in March 2026 that US home builder sentiment remained weak, with the NAHB Wells Fargo index at 38 for a 23rd straight month below the break-even 50 mark. Builders cited higher construction costs and persistent strain in the home building environment. That matters because lumber is not an optional embellishment in single-family construction. It is one of the core materials. When duties stack up on Canadian softwood, the cost does not stay at the border. It travels into framing, home prices, renovation costs, builder margins, and already fragile affordability. So the US problem is not simply Canada charges more. The US problem is that it is still structurally tied to Canadian supply while choosing a trade regime that makes that supply costlier and less certain. And domestic substitution is not fast enough to solve that. Reuters reported back in 2025 that tariffs were likely to accelerate the Canadian industry's long-running shift south into the US South and push Canadian firms to hunt for more non-US markets. That tells you something important. Even when some capacity moves geographically closer to the US market, the broader response is slow, capital-intensive, and strategic. It is not a quick replacement story, which means tariffs can raise costs now, while the promised domestic adjustment takes years and may never fully compensate. That is where the old political message collapses. Because the slogan is "Protect America," but the mechanism is tax and input America still needs. That is not industrial strength. That is cost transfer. And in an economy already dealing with weak builder sentiment, expensive mortgages, and strained affordability, that matters. Now turn back to Canada. The near-term pain is real. Higher duties make Canadian shipments less competitive in their largest market. Margins get squeezed. Producers have to absorb more volatility. Entire regions tied to forestry feel the shock. There is no serious version of this story where Canada walks away untouched. Reuters reported on March 31, 2026, that Canada's economy had struggled in the wake of Trump's tariffs on steel, autos, aluminum, lumber, copper, and other products, and that those measures had weakened manufacturing output. The next day, Reuters reported Canada's manufacturing PMI had slipped to 50.0, with output and new orders weakening and tariffs continuing to hurt business confidence. So the lumber dispute is no longer just a sectoral irritation. It is one thread in a wider industrial squeeze. That is the third major development since an October 2025 script. Lumber now has to be read as part of a broader deterioration in Canada-US trade conditions, not as a standalone quarrel. And the Bank of Canada itself basically validated that reading last fall. Reuters reported on October 29, 2025, that the bank cut its 2025 and 2026 growth forecasts, saying about half of the downgrade reflected tariffs and uncertainty, with the rest tied to weaker demand caused by US trade policy. That is crucial because it shows how the central bank saw the issue. Not simply as a border tax on one product, but as a drag on confidence, demand, and economic momentum more broadly. That is why the rewrite should not frame this as just Trump attacked Canadian lumber. It should frame it as the US has turned lumber into part of a stacked tariff regime that is reshaping business behavior, raising American construction costs, and accelerating Canada's move from complaint into adaptation. That is the real new moment. Now let's sharpen the asymmetry. For the US, the cost shows up mainly through housing, construction, and input inflation. For Canada, the cost shows up mainly through sector pain, margin compression, and forced strategic adjustment. The important thing is that both sides pay, but not in the same way. America pays because it is taxing its own build-out. Canada pays because its dominant market is becoming less secure. That is why this is such an interesting and complex story. It is not a clean win for either side. It is a coercive policy that creates domestic pain in the target country and self-imposed friction in the initiating country. And once that happens long enough, everyone starts adjusting. Ottawa adjusts through support, freight changes, and diversification. Firms adjust through rerouting, market search, and southward investment. The U.S. housing sector adjusts through higher costs and weaker affordability. And the old model of frictionless continental integration gets a little weaker each time. So here is the real tradeconomics take. The latest development on lumber is not a resolution. It is entrenchment. Washington has locked in a more punitive, layered tariff regime. Canada has stopped behaving as if this is temporary and started building around it. And the result is a harder, costlier North American market where the U.S. still depends on Canadian wood, but insists on making that dependence more expensive, while Canada keeps learning that access to the U.S. market is no longer something it can treat as secure. That is the shift. Not just more tariffs, a different structure. A structure where housing affordability in America gets worse, industrial confidence in Canada gets weaker, and both countries pay for the breakdown of predictability. So here's the question that matters now. Is this still really about protecting U.S. producers? Or has the lumber fight become another case where trade pressure damages the target, but also taxes the system that launched it? Because if it is the second one, then this is no longer just a dispute. It is a self-inflicted North American cost structure. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe, share, and hit the notification bell so you stay ready for the next breakdown. Because at Tradeconomics, we don't stop at the headline. We track the pressure, the leverage, the winners, the losers, and the deeper economic forces reshaping the world in real time. See you in the next video.